So I anticipate a slate which is pretty darn remarkable, that will have gone through 4 types of review: administrative review, internal scientific review, review by experts at the Air Board, and then external peer review. Each of them will have scrubbed for the filter of, do you sequester carbon? All of them will have a rigorous monitoring program to prove that effect. That's a step towards getting some stuff done. Similarly, as most of you know, our department now has $285 million for a competitive grant-making program. What we've just done with the Air Board's revenue of $25 million, we did in 8 months. We're going to use the same structure so that by the end of this year, I'm able to approve our first round of grants under that Proposition 1 money. Why is that relevant to you? My third point. If you haven't read Chris Janelle's guiding document, the Water Action Plan, I encourage you to. Go to page 9. Half of page 9 is about the headwaters. And specifically, there's an assignment in there to my department, and I'm an attorney, so I understand the view that some read the Constitution as a living document. I understand the view that some read it as a strict constructionist. I'm a strict constructionist when it comes to the Water Action Plan. It says the department, with partners, will restore 10,000 acres of mountain meadow habitat. We're going to get that done in the next 4 years. And here's where it ends. If you want to make that 20,000 acres, Randy, call me. If you want to make it 30,000 acres, Dave, call me. Urgency to restore.
Thank you, Chuck. Fran, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
I have my list of 3 as well. There's somewhat slightly different. One is I'm here bringing a message from the CASA, the California Association of Wastewater Agencies. They have lots of biosolids and really are interested in a pilot in a burnt area for quickly restoring some of the nutrients to that area. There are other CASAs, other organizations that are out there who have assets that you may be able to use in the forest that you don't know these people, and they're not your friends, but you should get to know them because they are great. And so think in terms of pilots, or think in terms of working with maybe some odd bedfellows that you haven't thought about recently. The second is something that no one wants to hear, and we're going to have lots and lots and lots of meetings. We're going to have to get to know each other. If you don't know us, it's because we don't see each other, but maybe once a year, or maybe once every 2 years, or sometimes every 3 years. That's not enough. You've got to meet on a regular basis with your watershed groups, either within the watershed or along the watershed, which however you are organizing, but lots and lots of meetings, and just schedule them. I just know it's going to happen. Know you're going to be on the phone sometime. Know you're going to have to be meeting all the time. I talked with Alex before he took over the leadership of East Bay Mud, and he was head of the McCollum Watershed program. And he said, I said, if there was just one thing you could do in terms of restoring the McCollum watershed, what is it? And he said, meetings. He said, it's absolutely critical, because that's how we've gotten to know each other and trust each other. And finally, again, this is kind of odd, but it goes to the rimfire. San Francisco PUC went before the accounting, the Federal Accounting Bureau last year to try to get them to include forests as something that could be bonded, as having value. Right now, when they put in their request for FEMA money, or for money to get back on the fire, they can only claim the buildings that were burned. They had to be terribly creative to get as much money as they could, but forests don't count. Wetlands do. After Katrina, the accounting Gatsby put in wetlands as something that could be bonded, and funded, but forests don't count yet. Conservation doesn't count yet. If you're going to do conservation, you're going to have to do it from your operating fund. So those are three odd things to be thinking about, not your kind of normal stuff.
Okay, thanks, Fran. I just want to call it, so there are kind of three sets of stuff that we've been looking at. This is what we wanted to do with the agenda. Some of the stuff we've heard, just some examples from Fran, the most recent ones, thinking a little bit about the strategic integration, so the regular meetings, some of the stuff that you need to do to actually make it work within your agencies. The second piece was some of these investment areas. We heard a little bit about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and several others. And then the third piece was about some of these policy areas where you have impediments or sticking points, a little bit about classification in this last example. So I invite all of you, we've had nobody from this side yet, any of those topics, the integration, the investment, or policy. John, go ahead.
Good afternoon. As I mentioned, I'm John Buckley with the Central Sierra Environmental Resource Center, a nonprofit organization. I spent 13 years as a firefighter with the Forest Service. I was in the rim fire yesterday. I've spent more than 100 days in the rim fire, and we could spend the entire time here today just discussing how catastrophic that fire was in many places, including in some of the areas of spectacular old growth in Yosemite Park. What I would focus on, though, and I will have 4 points that are brief instead of the 3s that have been going, but one is that I'm with a co-chair with a member of the timber industry for the Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions, the YSS group. In that collaborative group with the incredibly broad range of interests, we've moved past people having positions that are strongly held and focused on interests where we have areas of agreement. That's something I think that can be replicated other places because we've really worked well together and have come to a lot of agreements. The challenge is great leaders like Barney and Randy or others at the state level for years have been talking about this need for an increased pace and scale of restoration. At least for 15 years, I've been attending meetings where this has been the objective, and yet we're here at another meeting. So with all due respect to the value of meetings, the question is how do we move from this meeting to something that's measurable to make a difference? So 4 quick suggestions. One is there's an incredible need to manage fire because it is, as Hugh and others have always underscored, it's going to burn. And the challenge has been is when I talk with fire managers at the forest level, they consistently point out the challenges that not are directly necessarily tied to the airborne and constraints, but often are secondary hurdles and barriers caused by the impediments of regulatory requirements that are not seeing the fact that the emissions that are generated from managed burns in many cases are problematic for those with emphysema or whatever, but in contrast to the rim fire type events or others, they're meaningless. So one step I would suggest is that somehow federal agency and state agency leaders meet with the Air Board staff to hear from the Air Board what changes are possible that could double to triple the amount of managed fire that's taking place in the Sierra Nevada on both federal and private lands. A second quick point is that the reality has already been brought up about capacity. The Forest Service is also strictly, limited to how much their staffs are able to do in terms of planning and implementation on the ground. Somehow, if there's not a broad support to Congress or others to increase the amount of personnel that are available to do the planning, to do the implementation, to do the administration, there's only a certain capacity by the Forest Service. That pace and scale is not likely to be significantly elevated until there's better capacity. And that's partly funding, is partly the ability to get more staff. A third key challenge is, and this may be a little bit of surprise to you to hear it coming from the environmental community, but the NEPA process is a lengthy process that is cumbersome and in many cases blocks things getting done. For rim fire reforestation, it is going to take 2 years from the beginning of the planning to where there's a decision to plant trees back out where trees were already on the ground. There should be the ability for state and federal leaders to get together with Cal EPA, with others, with Chuck, with wildlife and others, to identify what criteria could be allowed to achieve a streamlined NEPA for restoration treatments that fall within a category that's very clearly defined and that can build trust from the interest. And the last thing I would put forward is that right now there is a lack of sufficient markets. That was brought up. There's been a couple times, especially for biomass. If we're looking to thin the submersible and in some cases the small sawlog trees that are not economically, profitable to bring long distances out, even with SPI's mills or other mills, there may not be the market to provide for the treatments and the products that are the basis for all of these watershed treatments. So all of those four things together need to be steps that are achieved, or else at some point we may look back in 2 years and think, did we just have another meeting? So thank you.
Thank you, John. Dave, did you want to say something? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to say ditto to what John just said. And the interesting thing, I think, too, is I was talking to Jonathan Kuzel just before we sat down, and about 15, 20 years ago, we had a very similar discussion group that we had put together, and Gray Eagle, John helped to organize that effort, and I think back to that effort, and at that point in time, it was a bunch of desperate stakeholders who didn't trust each other, who even were throwing Coke cans, as I recall, at one of those meetings. But ultimately, and of course, we were talking past each other, so we never got anywhere. And I'd like to say that in the last 15 to 20 years, we have made huge progress in that regard. I think what we have found in terms of trying to identify the real problems that we need to jointly come together on and working together as teams. We have a group with the Nature Conservancy and Aqua and RCRC and ourselves and others, seeing the Conservancy, trying to take a look at these issues that are problematic for our forest. I mean, as Hugh said, why it's not a matter of if, but when. And we can't just sit back and assume that the do-nothing alternative will be the best alternative. We need to take some risk and move forward, which means we need to have bold action. We have to really identify, I think, a bold agenda that moves us forward in the vegetation of our management, recognizing that we're in drought, recognizing the potential impacts of climate change, and recognizing the condition of our forest, and find the solutions to move together at an operational scale, a pilot project that uses the best science that we have, and if we make mistakes, the next project will use the better science that we have. But we really don't. I think Chuck was absolutely right. We don't have the time. I mean, urgency is a key word in anything that we do.
Jonathan?
Well, Dave started into a couple of points that I wanted to make. I guess I want to get us back to the 3 points idea. But before I do that, I just want to thank Hugh Safford for his presentation, not only for the content and help setting the stage for this conversation, but it's the first time I can honestly say somebody's more depressing than me at a gathering, as I would typically talk about rural communities. Anyone who followed me was always depressed themselves because everyone was pretty glum. Due to the state of rural communities. And I really appreciate Barney's remark saying this is a social and an economic issue as well, and it really is. I want to just go back to some of the research that we have done, some of the projects that the Sierra Institute for Community and Environment has been involved in. And the first point is collaboration can and has succeeded in a number of instances. And let me just offer, we looked at the Secure Rural School and Community Self-Determination Act, which was passed in 2000 that set up these resource advisory committees across the country. We said, is this working? We have to understand that before we look at renewing that legislation. Out of the 16 areas that we went in, 15 had RACs, 14 exceeded even the most optimistic perspectives of those of us looking at that. And it wasn't a preordained conclusion. We looked hard, we interviewed, we went to where they were doing work. And it was working. And it was working famously. And in fact, so many of the folks, and this goes back to Dave saying, yeah, 20 years ago, folks are saying, I do not want to get in the room with that individual. I do not want to sit next to them. I've been fighting them for so long. I don't want to do that. To the point where they're saying, you know, I've actually learned something. And oh, by the way, we're working on a project outside of the Resource Advisory Committee together. We've got these other things going. So it has succeeded and can succeed. We also already have some young projects here in California through the Department of Agriculture, through the Forest Service, and the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, where there's 3 of them going, and now the Forest Service is launching the cohesive strategy, looking at a couple of other areas, pulling together groups to talk about how to implement landscape level kinds of management. And we launched a group called SCALE, which a very savvy district ranger came up with the acronym, which is the Sierra Cascades All Land Enhancement Effort. And it really grew out of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy conversation and talking with partners about what we're doing, where we're going, how we move it. And they now regularly meet and talk about how we move landscape level kinds of issues. And it's really quite significant. It's new and it is successful so far. And there are activities, and now let me then talk very specifically about a specific example, the Bernie Hack Creek Community Forest and Watershed Group, which the Sierra Institute has been privileged to work with, where they identified a watershed where they wanted to work. And in that area, it's about 400,000 acres in the northern Sierra, southern Cascade area. They identified a watershed. They said there needs to be restoration work in this particular area. And we drew together the private landowners, the private industrial landowners, Sierra Pacific, Fruit Growers Supply, and a couple of others, including PG&E, and a private land management company, where they have come together and first identified a couple of hundred acres, and it's now up to over 2,000 acres. And I explained this to and thanked Ken Pimlott about a month or 2 or 3 ago, and he was pretty surprised that there's actually somebody approaching him saying thank you to the efforts of your staff for helping lead that effort, because that's not normally what happens when someone approaches you who you don't really know. But it was true. CAL FIRE helped lead the way for that particular project, but it did not only involve the Forest Service, it did not only involve CAL FIRE, it involved a variety of state agencies coming together in the context of identifying those issues that need to be addressed before the plan is made concrete and then refused or goes back through the cycle a number of times. It sailed through. The timber harvest plan that was proposed went through in less than 3 weeks. The average is more like 9 months for approval, that approval process. So here's the one negative part of that. So they identified all the timber that could be taken off of that and thinned for this watershed improvement effort, but there is nowhere to take it, because it's mostly small timber. This is where we need to look at and focus on opportunities to take this material somewhere. So that project has started, but it's sitting mostly because there isn't the opportunity nor places to take that material.
Go ahead. I got a couple people in the queue. Got a couple people in the queue, just so you know, so I'll go Edie and then Dave, and then I see David, and I'll come to Russ. Go ahead,
Okay.
Edie.
I was trying to figure out whether I could actually one-up everybody and have 5 issues, but I think it's actually only 3, and I was just trying to parse them out to make the 5 to one-up people. So I think that, the smoke management issue, obviously that's something that, our primary objective is to protect public health. I think it's something that it's not new to us that there have been concerns about. Are there, how that restricts the ability of folks to employ prescribed fire, and obviously that's a conversation that we're happy to have with folks as you guys and other groups continue to think about how we manage our forest. And so that's something that, we can talk with folks about. On the climate side, the scoping plan is the document that we use to lay out our blueprint for how we're going to meet our greenhouse gas goals. We recognize in the first scoping plan the importance of the forests, and I think that's only been emphasized as we've moved forward. As Ashley mentioned, the governor in the state has emphasized the role of natural lands, and we've heard that, and I think you all have heard that loud and clear. There's a number of efforts that have spun out of the update to the scoping plan, looking at how we look at forest carbon. There's a forest carbon plan that that a number of agencies are working on, and we started a public process a couple weeks ago and have had 2 workshops about that. So I think that there's just on the natural resources side, there's a fair amount that's happening. I think it's important to acknowledge, but I think there's also other connections, as Ashley mentioned. One of the really important programs that we have in the scoping plan is this low carbon carbon fuel standard. We're trying to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. And this really gets to some of these markets issues that folks are bringing up here. You know, we think that the low carbon fuel standard helps to provide a pull into the market of these lower carbon fuels. And I think what we're trying to understand better now is it really providing the pull that we want? Are there places that we need or want, or we can identify ways that we can provide better regulatory drivers for that? And that leads me into the last issue, which is I was joking with Ashley. I sort of feel like I was invited here to be everybody's banker, because it's the cap and trade auction proceeds, which everybody sort of looks at with, you know, dollar signs in their eyes. So there is, you know, this fund, and this is the second year that we're actually spending money out of that fund. This is also the year that we are working on a new investment plan. So that the way, this sort of a very bureaucratic system, but we develop a 3-year investment plan. And this plan lays out what our priorities are as an administration. What do we want to fund over the next 3 years? And we are thinking about not just what happens in the next 3 years, but how does this help us build towards meeting our midterm goals in 2030 and our longer-term goals in 2050. So we're working on the second round of this investment plan. That's something that's going to happen this year, and I think this is a really great opportunity for the forest community, for the natural lands community generally, to identify what priorities you have, and to be able, there's never going to be enough money to do everything. There's just, you know, we all know that, but where should we be targeting things? How can we develop programs so that we're taking advantage of some of these, you know, whether it's a watershed or other sort of geographic boundary? How do we do that in a smart way? And I think that there's a lot of interest on the part of the administration in looking at how we can do things on natural lands, and we need input in a way that we can, you know, try to reflect this in that plan. So I think those were the, oh, the other thing that I just wanted to mention is Ashley talked about sort of the restrictions, I'm going to say, that we have to make sure that all of the programs that we fund out of the auction proceeds actually provide benefits. I think that there are creative ways that we can still experiment and test and research even with those restrictions. And so it may be a project that we're doing and we're trying something a little bit different in one aspect of it or something. So I think that there are ways that we can incorporate that, but we just need to be a little creative about how we do it.
Okay, so I got Dave and then David and then Russ, and just for a time check for people, we got about probably 15, 20 minutes before we open up to some audience questions, and I know we got about 7 people that haven't spoken, so we'll do the best we can on time. Dave?
Okay, I'll try to make it real short. I won't even number my comments. I'll just get on with it. Dave Bolin with Aqua. Just wanted to touch on a couple of themes here and point out that catastrophe really does focus us. We've seen that the Rim Fire has drawn a lot of attention by water agencies, not just the ones that were affected, but the ones that saw that their watersheds are vulnerable as well. We've even got a longer track record with, say, the old fire in Southern California and, you know, some of the fires in San Diego County that really did impact water agencies, water supply impacts, direct impacts, sedimentation, all kinds of quality issues, as well as threats to supply. And again, in typical Aqua fashion, we've attacked it with a huge committee of folks that worked for a long time on some policy principles for headwaters management. First of all, we realized it wasn't just about the Sierra. There are all these other headwater areas around the state, Southern California and the Coast Ranges, in which the same issue is at hand here, and that we need to look at, you know, kind of the headwaters as it relates back to the entire watershed all the way down to the ocean, and looking at these systems as coherent systems, and that it's not the upstream, downstream, it's all of us, and we all have to work this thing out. And so luckily we have a membership that represents that diversity, and so for internal and external purposes, we put together this Headwaters Framework document, which we're just about to debut. It's actually already been printed, and it's going to be coming out on March 19th, a little plug here. And in that document, we've got a lot of recommendations, but there's a major recognition of this idea, some of the themes here in terms of shared interests, the idea that no one entity or any group of entities even, no governments at various levels are going to get this all done. We're going to have to work in a way we've never worked before, an integrated sort of way. Partnershiping, bold steps, pilot projects, a lot of the themes that are exhibited here, and some of them are actually documented in this document, some things that are actually working. and just kind of putting a plug in for the TNC and some of the work that they've been doing, and a report that's about to come out there too, on some, I guess, examples of how to quantify benefits looking forward, and also how to avoid impacts long-term, and recognizing that if we don't anticipate and avoid those impacts, that we are going to be paying enormous amounts out of our blood, sweat, and treasury to try to adapt to conditions that are requiring this integrated approach. So I guess the conclusion is, yes, catastrophe is necessary, and I guess the idea of anticipating that the things that we're seeing now are trends. A lot of the work that was done at the very beginning to set the stage here, again, is very much shared in our document and by the research that we're aware of that all the various participants have. And so sharing the story, sharing it with the public as a whole, looking at it from the point of view of not just water supply, but all the benefits that can accrue to better responsible management in the ecosystems, and then trying to break it out into actionable pilot-type projects that demonstrate the proof of concept, I think are things that we're looking forward to.
Thank you, Dave. David?
Yeah, David Edelson with the Nature Conservancy, and thanks for having me. I'm hearing a lot of congruence among the comments, but I'll go forward with my three in any event. And really just want to mention three ideas from the Nature Conservancy's perspective that I think that maybe the group should consider and can discuss. The first relates to prioritizing, putting a priority on quantifying the water-related benefits from watershed restoration. And we've heard, from Bob Kirkwood and others that, we think that the downstream beneficiaries are kind of getting off easy here, but the reality is we need to make an economic case for why it makes sense for downstream beneficiaries to invest. And towards that end, the Nature Conservancy is going to be releasing in a couple of weeks a report that aims to quantify the water and economic benefits from forest thinning and from doing ecologically based restoration in the Northern Sierra. So keep your eyes out for that. And just to give a preview of it, it suggests that the benefits can be considerable. The caveat, though, is that we really need more and better research, specifically in the Sierra Nevada, to quantify what those water benefits are. And I think there's no reason that we all working together can't make it a priority to get those kind of landscape scale projects on the ground so we can get the information that we need that hopefully will provide an increased funding source for the work. So that's the first one, is to quantify the water benefits. The second is the importance of working at scale, and others have mentioned this as well. What the science is telling us is that we need to increase by anywhere from 2 to 10 times the scale of ecologically based forest restoration. And we can't realistically expect the Forest Service to do 2 or 10 times as many projects as it's currently doing. But what I think we can and should think about creatively is increasing the size of the projects that we're doing. So rather than doing controlled burns on 200 acres at a time, and rather than doing thinning on 2,000 acres at a time, we probably need to consider ramping that up by an order of magnitude. And, to the possible objection, that there are regulatory barriers to doing that, then let's be creative and take a look at what those barriers are and figure out a way to get the work done in a way that doesn't gut the environmental laws, which none of us want, but that does facilitate the kind of landscape scale work that needs to happen. So that's the second point. How do we work at scale? The third is one I haven't heard so far, so I'll mention this. With respect to meadows, we've been very encouraged by the California Water Action Plan and by Mr. Bonham's commitment to actually getting all that work done that's specified in there in terms of restoring mountain meadows. But one of the obstacles to doing that is that the predominant approach right now is to bring heavy machinery into meadows and to reconfigure streams and meadows, and it's both expensive and controversial. And I would suggest there is another overlooked approach to meadow restoration, and that is to really look seriously at the role of beavers in both restoring and maintaining meadows. I think beavers are nature's engineers. Other states are way ahead of us in using beavers proactively to achieve environmental benefits. There are, it is the case, as with everything else, there's always trade-offs. beavers can cause problems, and that needs to be addressed in developing a statewide plan and policy for beavers. But I think the reality is that beavers are a lot cheaper than bulldozers and can do the job, I think, just as effectively. So,
Since we're sitting next to each other, let me just say,
It's a very Oregon State place.
yeah, there are several collections of different perspectives that have organized into kind of policy groups around the question of beavers. They're all on my calendar in the coming weeks. But I'm confident in saying there's probably a role for this going forward, and it should be an easier topic, I hope, than the question of wolves reintroducing themselves into California.
Just to pick up on that, on my property, the beavers have done a lot better job than I was able to do of raising the water table under the meadows.
Yeah, no, I kid you not. There's a cartoon on my desk from like a 1940s fishing game publication, and I had heard about this as myth while I was at Trout Unlimited. I kid you not. Our department put beavers in wooden cages in the 40s and airdropped them into the Kern Plateau so that they would chew themselves out of the wooden cages and swim back into the waters and do what beavers do.
I'm sure they had parachutes.
I have a cartoon, it's a publication on my desk that kind of suggests that may have actually happened.
So I got three people in the queue. I got Russ, Vance, and then Lee. Go ahead, Russ.
Well, thank you, and I just wanted to also echo the sense of urgency that a number of people have voiced today. I think we really are at a point of departure, not just in our forests and climate change, but internationally in general in climate change. A lot of people are also looking with great urgency towards the next big international meeting on climate change, which is in Paris in December, and I speak French, so I think they should send me. But the urgency is important, and at the same time, I think we also need to remember that it's taken us a long time to get into this problem in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of our forest management situation, and it's going to take us a lot of time to get out of it. So while we need to get in I usually hesitate on using sports analogies, but we need to be down on the starting blocks and got off to a really fast start here. But we need to recognize that this is a marathon; it's not a sprint, and it's going to take a long time of sustained work to make progress in this area. Dorian and others mentioned the themes of policy, integration, and investment, and I just wanted to mention an effort that's recently started that I think tries to pull all these pieces together, and that's the initial work that's getting started to develop the forest carbon plan for California. And this is something that was called for in the last summer's AB 32 scoping plan update that ARB was responsible for. And so the state, taking the leadership, has now stood up the Forest Climate Action Team, which Ken Pimlott at CAL FIRE leads, and the Resources Agency, Cal EPA, ARB, many other entities represented in this room are supporting to do that work of developing the forest carbon plan. And so we are, as a part of that work, going to be taking very much an integrative approach that has carbon as a key focus of it, but is also looking at the full range of forest ecosystem values that we've been talking about here today. And one of the components we're going to be doing as a part of that is a related resource economics study that will help to bring forward some of that economic information that some of you in the room have talked about today. So we're just in the middle of, we've held over the past couple of weeks 2 public meetings on our work. We have a 3rd public meeting next week in Southern California to get our initial word out there, get some initial stakeholder input. But I think this is going to be the Forest Climate Action Team and the Forest Climate Carbon Plan are going to be some important venues for some of this work to occur at a high level, very integrated fashion. The intent is to set some statewide and regional goals for carbon sequestration, again, building on the governor's goals that our forests need to be net sinks of carbon. So I wanted to mention that as an important piece that's going on. And then finally, just in terms of funding, but this is just a drop in the bucket relative to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or Prop 1, but under Assembly Bill 1492 that was passed a couple years ago, and created a new funding mechanism for timber harvesting regulation as well as forest restoration in the state through a 1% assessment on lumber and wood products sold in the state. We are starting to try to move more of that money out for some forest restoration activities, which we hope will include some of the CAL FIRES programs for CFIP, California Forest Improvement Program, focused on management plans, improved management activities on small private owners, as well as some opportunities for fuels management activities. In the bill, legislation specifically calls for fuels management activities that are going to contribute to addressing climate change. So that's going to be small dollars compared to some of these other programs, but it's still money, and it can be targeted in certain ways that other money can't. So that'll be another piece that we're looking forward to hopefully seeing rolling out here at some point in not too distant future.
Okay, thank you, Russ. And just so people are aware of time, so it is 4 o'clock. I have Vance, and then I have Lee, and then I want to go and give an opportunity for the rest of our panelists who haven't spoken. I see Kamir's hand, and then I promise we'll come to public. So just bear with me. I want to make sure our panelists get one opportunity to speak, at least each. Vance?
Thanks, Dorian. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments about funding and capacity. People have mentioned these in various forms of comments. It's great to have the state, federal agencies having programs available. There's private sources of funding. We're a foundation. We fund projects as well. But all of these programs are oversubscribed. We always have to turn away people that apply to our programs. Part of that is actually due to capacity. So how do we build that capacity, especially in rural areas where it may be weak? It may not even exist, or there may be voluntary community groups or nonprofits that are overwhelmed by putting together proposals, or they don't even have the ability to do that. So I think we may need to figure out a way to deliver these programs better. I think, Chuck, you mentioned that that Fish and Wildlife did the delivery in 8 months. That's awesome. We need to figure out how to do that more and faster. And I think, as you said, there is an urgency there. And I think I'm one of the people that keeps saying, why aren't we doing more? And we just had a grant round for our capacity grants program that we've been doing. It's the 3rd round that we're doing. We've supported a number of the collaboratives that were mentioned, but I'd like to see that program expand. There's a lot of applicants from the Sierra Nevada and all over the state, but actually most of the applicants that apply to that program are from the Sierra Nevada. I think that says a lot about the capacity that's been built in part by Sierra Nevada Conservancy and others, and we need to figure out a way to do that more and accelerate the pace and scale of capacity, because that does lead to the acceleration of pace and scale of restoration.
Lee, and then Kamir.
Thank you. I've found this discussion fascinating, and most of it looking at the Sierra as the entire range from 30 or 40,000 feet. And I'd like to bring it back a little bit to ground zero of the small communities that dot the Sierra. Just as a preamble, I know the range as a 40-year resident. I live in Downeyville on the Yuba Watershed. My home borders National Forest boundary. In fact, I spent my first summer in the Sierra as a Forest Service firefighter. I would love to move to a new word from collaborate to compromise. That's not a word I've heard today, and I think that's one of the big things that have been missing in the discussions over the decades, that people sort of pull into their position and nothing gets done. And I certainly agree with Barney that most options are better than the status quo. From the RC County point of view, we would ask, please do no harm. We have very fragile economies and are very vulnerable communities. For my home county, at the end of the day, we're 1,000 square miles, 70% of it national forest land. I certainly understand our new role as a water sponge for California, and I'm fine with that. We're probably the least disturbed county in the state if you don't look at some hydraulic mining scars. But as has been said, this really is more about the Sierra. We need to get the message to the urban centers, and really we do need to get it as a matter of compromise. We can't keep this fight going until the place entirely burns up. So thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Kamiar and then Ken.